In 1925, the story of the New York Giants team began, the oldest representative of the northeastern United States in the NFL. 5 teams joined the league that season, but only the Giants managed to overcome all the vicissitudes of fate. For nearly 95 years of its history, the Giants have changed several stadiums, played 19 finals, 4 times became the strongest league team in the era of Super Bowls and before the merger of the NFL and AFL. This article begins publishing a translation of the book by Lawrence Pervin, a professor at Rutgers University and an avid fan of the team. The beginning, 1925 to 1953. In one of his speeches in Philadelphia, the British comedian Eddie Izzard expressed bewilderment at the American football game. Why is it called football, when the ball practically does not touch anyone's legs, and other parts of the body of most players? Of course, he contrasted American football with what the British call football and the rest of the world. There, the word is called a game in which kicking the ball by all players is of fundamental importance. Unlike her, hands are used in our football. Why, then, was he not called a handball? The answer to the question of the British comedian is connected with the roots of American football, a combination of European football, a game of gentlemen played by hooligans, and rugby, a game of hooligans played by gentlemen. The football that we know today is very different from the one played by the teams of Rutgers and Princeton universities in 1869, the participants of the first match in the history of student football. Points were scored by strikes through the goal line, not by moving the ball or driving it between goal posts. It was closer to what we call today soccer. A few years later, Canadian influence led to the fact that the players were allowed to run with the ball in their hands and make captures like in rugby. By 1890, there were more teams and new rules began to form that were approaching modern ones: downs, a set of yards, blocks, low-waist captures, touchdowns. The first attempt to standardize them was made in 1906. It included a pass forward, determining the neutral zone between defense and attack. 10 yards is the distance that must be traveled to set the first down. The key to the many changes that took place at that time was Alonzo Stagg, a former player and then coach of the University of Chicago team. He is credited with such fundamental innovations as passing forward, various constructions in the backfield, moving players before the draw, the use of numbers on the uniform, special mannequins in a slide for training. One story tells us that Stagg once rode on the same train as President Herbert Hoover. The train was met by a huge crowd and Stagg was amazed when he found out that they were football fans and not fans of the president who met him. The Stagg Field at the University of Chicago became the place where, in 1942, participants in the Manhattan Project conducted their first controlled nuclear reaction, which ultimately led to the creation of the atomic bomb. Now on the field with this name they play softball. Also significant contribution to the development of the game were Glenn Pope Warner, who was named after the Children's League tournament, and John Heisman, after whom the main individual student football prize was named. Warner created many of the earliest formations, such as single wing and double wing. Heisman made the Georgia Institute of Technology's program a football center for the country at the beginning of the 20th century and contributed to the growing popularity of the game throughout the country before the NFL. By 1915, they began to play football professionally. The match in Canton, Ohio, between the Canton Bulldogs and Mass Island Tigers, showed Jim Thorpe and Knute Rockne to the public. Native American Thorpe was an aggressive early back, excellent athlete, and 1912 Olympic champion in pentathlon and decathlon. Rockne is a Norwegian immigrant who grew up in Chicago and studied at the University of Notre Dame. He did great captures and was a reliable host. At that time, players took to the field in both defense and offense. Forward passes were already allowed by the rules. In that match, Thorpe scored 2 field goals and brought the Bulldogs a 6-0 victory. Rockne subsequently became an outstanding coach of the Notre Dame team, spent 5 seasons with her without defeats and won the national championship in 1924 and 1930. Part of one of his teams was the legendary Four Horsemen: quarterback Harry Stuldrear, midfielders Don Miller and Jim Crowley, fullback Elmer Lydon. It is also worth noting the 1928 season, when the team played for Gipper. George Hipp, who died of pneumonia in 1920, was an outstanding player in college. As he was dying, he asked Rockne, before one of the important games in the future, to urge everyone to play for Gipper. This game took place at the Yankee Stadium against the team of the military academy, and its Notre Dame football players won. Later, this story formed the basis of the film, in which the role of George Hipp was played by the future U.S. President Ronald Reagan. This game took place at the Yankee Stadium against the team of the military academy, and its Notre Dame football players won. Later, this story formed the basis of the film, in which the role of George Hipp was played by the future U.S. President Ronald Reagan. This game took place at the Yankee Stadium against the team of the military academy, and its Notre Dame football players won. Later, this story formed the basis of the film, in which the role of George Hipp was played by the future U.S. President Ronald Reagan. In 1920, the National Football League was founded. Before it, there were separate professional teams, but investing in them remained a risk. Players could freely move from one to another when they were offered a higher salary. At that time, football players on average received from $50 to $75 per game. In terms of current money, it is about $600. There was another problem: college players went out on the field for professional teams under false names. The composition could unrecognizably change before each game. In such circumstances, it was difficult to create a specific base of fans. In 1920, the first attempt was made to stabilize the situation. Representatives from 12 Midwestern cities met at the Hutnable Motor Show in Canton. Some sat on chairs, and the rest on the steps, which were then a mandatory part of the exterior of the cars. The result of their meeting was the creation of the American Professional Football Association. Its goals were to coordinate the schedule of games, introduce a ban on bets for players and control it, and prevent students from playing for professional teams. Already in 1921, teams played in muddy fields in Chicago, Green Bay, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, Buffalo, Canton, Akron, Dayton, Columbus, Rock Island, and Rochester. Notably, there were not enough teams in large cities on the East and West Coast. From a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand spectators gathered for matches. After the completion of the first season, the league became known as the National. Low attendance of games entailed financial problems for many of its members. The first full house took place only in 1925 in Chicago, when more than 30,000 fans came to Wrigley Field who wanted to see Red Grange, who played for Bears, owned by the legendary George Halas. A year later, in 1926, Grange participated in the creation of the American Football League. The competing tournament was closed after one season. There was an interest in professional football. 1925, Tim Mara brings professional football to New York. Since the newly created league enjoyed varying success with the public, and many teams experienced financial difficulties, NFL club owners felt that franchising in a major city on the East Coast was important for the future league. League president Joe Carr was sent in search of someone who could create it. He contacted Billy Gibson, manager Gene Tunney, world heavyweight boxing champion. Gibson did not want to take the risk on himself and advised Carr to turn to Tim Mara, who had previously invested in Tunney's career. So in 1925, Tim Mara became the owner of the Giants and brought professional football to New York. According to reports of those years, the cost of the franchise was $500, and about $25,000 more needed to be invested in order for the team to really function. In terms of the 2007 exchange rate, the initial purchase amount would be about $300,000. A good investment, given that in 1991 half of the team was sold for $75 million, and in 2007 its estimated value was already about $1 billion. Mara himself believed that franchise rights in New York were worth the money he paid. According to his son Wellington, his father believed that an empty store in the city was worth it. However, then the majority found such investments very risky, and in fact the league and the team went through financially difficult times before succeeding. Mara, before the purchase of the team, did not see a single football match, and gave the name to it in honor of the New York Baseball Club. The company immediately became virtually family-owned. His children, Jack, who was 17, and especially the 9-year-old Wellington, showed a keen interest in the team. Wellington later told how he first appeared in the stands of the Polo Grounds at a game with Frankfurt Yellow Jackets. "I sat with my mother right behind the Giants bench, and in the second half I went to the other side, to my brother. It was a bit cold that day, and after the match, the mother complained to her father that we were sitting in the shade. She asked why we cannot sit where the sun shines. Starting from the next game, the edge of our team has always been on the sunny side of the field." Mara was an experienced promoter and understood that a young team needs a player with the name and experience to attract viewers. He signed a contract with the great Jim Thorpe. Tom was already 37 years old. He could hardly spend a full game on the field, but he received $200 for half the match. Thorpe played just 3 games for the Giants. The early years were generally difficult for the club, both financially and professionally. The first 3 games ended in defeat, including 0-14 from the Yellow Jackets in their debut home game. Then they managed to carry out a series of 7 victories, and by the end of the first season in their history, the Giants were far ahead of almost all their rivals, becoming the 4th of 20 league teams. The team suffered losses, and many urged Mara to abandon this venture. However, in December, a gold mine opened. Chicago Bears arrived in New York with Red Grange, and more than 70,000 spectators gathered in the stands of the Polo Grounds. This significantly exceeded the capacity of the stadium and was at that time a record of league attendance. The game was very stubborn until the last minutes, when Grange intercepted and scored a touchdown for 35 yards, setting the final score of the match 19-7 in favor of Chicago. Despite the unfortunate defeat, the game allowed Mara to cover all his losses. She also became financially successful for Grange. According to reporters, he earned about $30,000 on this game, more than Mara spent on his team. Unhappy with the proposed Bears contract. For the remainder of the decade, the team played with varying success. On the one hand, in 1927 the first championship title was won, and the league was reduced from 22 to 12 teams and became more stable. On the other, in the next season, the Giants, already with the 3rd coach in history, were significantly inferior to their opponents and completed it unsuccessfully. In addition, for the 3rd year in a row, the team remained unprofitable. In an attempt to improve financially and professionally, a new coach was hired, a number of players were fired, and the whole Detroit Wolverines team was acquired. The latter was done for the star quarterback Benny Friedman. Little Friedman, 178 centimeters tall and weighing 83 kilograms, was considered one of the best hurdlers of his time. Red Grange called him the best quarterback he has ever played with. In the 1928 season, Friedman and Wolverines won in 2 games with the Giants and tied. In the first game, his removal and transfer led to a 28-0 success. In the second match, 2 pass touchdowns of Friedman allowed the team to catch up with the opponent. Thus, the Giants knew from their own experience what they received by signing a contract with him. The new quarterback did not disappoint them. He became the league leader with 19 touchdowns, 8 of whom were caught by Ray Flaherty, another star who joined the team in 1929. In addition to fulfilling his immediate duties, Friedman was the best in the league in terms of the number of extra points implemented. It more than matched the NFL's highest salary of $10,000 per season. In addition to improving results, the appearance of Friedman made the team profitable for the first time since 1925. Towards the end of the first decade of the NFL's history, the Giants were a young team that successfully rescheduled an attempt to invade its territory from a rival league represented by the Yankees.